Hi, we continue today in Luke chapter 8 in the parable of the sower, which we began last time looking at the first part where Jesus names the parable to the large crowd. And now today we're going to look at how the disciples come to and ask for the explanation of it. But before he gets to the explanation, which we'll look at next video, he pauses to make an implicit reference back to Isaiah 6. So to set ourselves in context, let's remember where we've been and where this passage on the parable of the sower is in the larger section of Luke 7 and 8 that you see on the right side of the screen that we've been following here, where this whole section is framed by the two pairs of stories of a high-status male and a low-status female, and the other details you can see there that enclose this series of episodes around forms of resistance. And in our section now on the parable of the sower and the lamp, which we'll get to, which Luke got from Mark here, after the ones we followed that were Luke's originals, we'll see how what follows are the parts that are in quotes, are little stories and other parables about how the testing or the cares, riches, and pleasures of life can distract people from staying faithful to the way of Jesus. And so we've been looking also at how Luke takes the original he got from Mark and changes it radically, and changes it very differently than Matthew over in the green on the right side. As we saw last time, Luke's is much shorter, and in the part we looked at last time, you can see how he leaves out all the parts from Mark that are in bold, which Matthew also leaves out, but leaves out from Mark parts that Matthew included, which are the struck-through parts here. So he really eliminates a lot, and similarly in the part we're going to look at today, all the part that's in bold here, Luke leaves out. But in addition to that, Matthew goes wild on this, including not only some of these things, but changing it wildly, leaving out not only the part that Mark has here, but adding all of this down to here. And so we'll look at those in a little bit to see how Matthew is running with the Isaiah 6 thing, and Luke in many ways is running away from it. So let's look back at the transition here. We saw in the beginning that Mark's Jesus is said to be speaking to a large crowd from a boat. So Jesus is on the boat in the sea, and the crowd is beside the sea on the land. So there's a real shift here. When he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him. So it suggests here that the end of the teaching, even though this is not that long a teaching, you'd think to bother to get in the boat, you might say more than what's a paragraph or so. And Mark doesn't seem to suggest there's more teaching that's not covered here, but that's Mark's issue. We're not on Mark on this series of videos. But we do see there's a big transition. So it highlights that Mark's Jesus is speaking directly to the 12 and those who are around him, whoever those are. It's ironic, of course, when he was alone, he's not alone at all. Looking over to Matthew here, it's like Luke has when the disciples came and asked him. At least there's a movement of the disciples away from the crowd. And of course, Matthew also has it Mark had, that Jesus had went out of the house and sat beside the sea and got into a boat. And so the disciples must be understood here as coming to him in the boat, as opposed to in the house, which is a theme throughout Matthew. We're not going to look at Matthew's gospel in detail here, but that meeting Jesus in the house, both the physical house and as the late Michael Crosby wrote in his wonderful book, House of Disciples, a long time ago on Matthew, that the image of house as community was a central understanding of Matthew's course of discipleship, that gathering around Jesus in a community. But Luke has a very different version of it. The disciples just asked him right out of the crowd. There's no separation between Jesus and the crowd in terms of being on the boat or on the shore. The people have just gathered around. So we picture here the disciples maybe up close to him where Jesus can hear them, but amidst the crowd. There's no separation here, even though he's going to speak to you and about others. But he's speaking to the disciples with the others seemingly right there. And that may have a lot to do with Luke's understanding of where discipleship fits in while the Roman neighbors and perhaps even Roman officials are listening, and why Jesus speaks the way he does. But we'll get there in just a minute. So the disciples asked him what the parable meant. Literally, what is this parable? So they're not specifically asking for an interpretation or understanding in the sense of a mental clarity. They're simply asking, what is this? And as we looked at last time, that may be asking about the assumption that the translators make here about the meaning of the parable. But we might also note that, as we saw last time, they just start speaking out of nowhere here. It's not in the middle of teaching, and there's no sense that there's a plan. He just starts talking and telling this story about the sower and the seed. So they may simply be asking, what are you talking about? Like, why are you telling us this parable, apart from what it might mean in detail? This is the first time we've seen the disciples with Jesus and talking to them since chapter 6, verse 20. So a while ago, and these various things that we've been seeing in chapter 7 and 8, the disciples weren't there. We don't know what happened at Simon the Pharisee's house. Were they there at the meal? Probably not. Probably Simon didn't invite Jesus and his whole entourage to have a meal at his house, so they perhaps weren't there. And of course, this story was about the women who were supporting Jesus and the disciples, but they've been silently in the background for quite a while now. And so the key verse is verse 10 here, and we can see it both in the blue part here where all that Luke adds here is to others, but that's an important distinction as opposed to those outside. And then he paraphrases Isaiah. So let's look at what Luke has here, and then we'll look in more detail at the question of secrecy and Isaiah and how he used it here. So he said, to you has been given to know, and gnomai here from the infinitive gnosko, which some scholars have suggested is an infinitive here that implies inside knowledge, so it's something special about them. And then we hear secrets, and we'll come back to that in a second. Luke uses the plural mysteria, secrets of the kingdom of God. It's the only time Luke uses that term in the Gospel or in Acts. And again, we'll come back to that in a minute. But to others, the loipois, those who are not us, basically, but not in a pejorative sense. Not in the way that Jews sometimes refer to Gentiles or Romans refer to the barbaroi or barbarians, but simply the separation of us and them in a not necessarily a hostile way. But there is a difference, as we hear in what follows. To others I speak in parables, so that looking they may not perceive, and listening they may not understand. Period. And that's all he goes on here. And notice, New RSV has the little quotes in here suggesting that that's a quote from Isaiah. And it sort of is, but it sort of isn't. And Luke's Jesus doesn't say it's from Isaiah, and Luke, the narrator here, doesn't say it's from Isaiah. So let's look first at secrets, mystery there, and then we'll look at the Isaiah quote in a second. So there are three different Greek words that can be translated secret in Luke or elsewhere in the Greek Bible. The one we have here is mysterion, singular, or mysteries, or mysteria, plural. And as I just noted, it's the only time here is in Luke. And I've color-coded these according to Luke in blue and other New Testament ones in red and Septuagint ones in purple. Notice that's used many more times in Paul, 19 times in Paul, in a couple of different ways, singularly as the mystery of God, but God's mysteries plural. And similarly, John of Patmos has the mystery of God, and that's an apocalyptic mode, which is to say that this is a mystery that can't be learned or figured out just by studying the way a scientist might figure out the mystery of something by using scientific method, but something that requires revelation, requires God inbreaking with some kind of knowledge that humans couldn't get to otherwise. Sometimes today theologians refer to God as mystery in the ultimate sense of God's not a puzzle to be solved, not like a mystery story like Agatha Christie or something, but in the sense of beyond the capacity of human beings to understand. But that's only one of a couple of words, and before we finish look at other words, let's see how it applies in apocalyptic texts like Daniel. And so we see the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision, exactly the point I was making above about it took a revelation to convey it. But notice that mysterion is also used in wisdom literature, both in the Book of Wisdom here and then in Sirach, as a quote from here for using a different word, and Sirach and wisdom down there. Because in the wisdom tradition, again, not just the Book of Wisdom, but the sections of the Bible that are understood as wisdom literature, especially the Septuagint parts that are not in the Hebrew Bible, as the Book of Wisdom and Sirach represent, that the wise, which is taking it from Daniel 12 as well, people who are in on the apocalyptic secret, but have a certain kind of wisdom, can understand what's going on with God. And so we see that quote here, the opponents reasoned but were led astray, for their wickedness blinded them. They did not know the secret purposes of God, nor hope for the wages of holiness. In other words, if a person wasn't evil, they could know the secret purposes of God. It could be revealed. And in the wisdom literature, that's often through nature or through reason. So they reasoned properly, but were led astray by their wickedness. So a second word that Luke uses for that's translated secret is apokryphos here, and it's only 3 times in the New Testament, in contrast with mysterion, which is 28 times in the New Testament, once in Luke, once in Paul, and so Luke has it here for nothing is hidden that will not be disclosed. Again, just 7 verses from where we are now, nor is anything secret that will not become known. Using the same word here, no, using different words, I'm sorry, that the secret is the one here and hidden is the one here. So the same verse has 2 of these words. And of course, it's a poetic parallel here. What is hidden nothing is hidden that will not be disclosed, nor is anything secret will not become known, replicating Hebrew poetry and that kind of doubling. Here, though, the words are taken directly from Mark 22, not elsewhere in the Gospel. So it's simply Luke's echo of it and Matthew's echo of it are the only places that we hear those words. So also Paul has it in the Gospels, that is. Paul has it in Colossians here, again connected with mystery. And we note that it's also used in apocalyptic and wisdom literature in the same kind of way that mysterion was. And then finally, kryptos, from which we get words like crypto, as in the ever not cryptocurrency in the current word, or the planet that Superman was from, of course, Krypton, an element named for that as well. The element not named for the planet, I don't think. Maybe it was. No, I don't think so. So 17 times in the New Testament, but 19 times in the Septuagint as well. And Luke, again, the same verse as I already noted, nothing is hidden that will not be disclosed. And then later, nothing is covered up that will not become uncovered, nothing secret that will not become known. Making the same point 4 chapters later, but using slightly different language, but using kryptos in both cases. And notice that Matthew uses it a couple times here about prayer and relationship with God. John uses it ironically in that same kind of way, where his non-believing brothers, uniquely to John, suggest that Jesus, if he wants to be known public, shouldn't be doing things in secret. And Jesus disclaims he's done anything in secret when he's on trial in chapter 18. Paul uses it also for secret thoughts, things that are not hidden from God, but are hidden, that people hide from each other. And in 1 Peter, it's translated as inner self. Literally, it's inner secret heart there. And again, Sirach and Wisdom are books that use those words. So Luke uses all three of these words, but here we're using mysterion, and he doesn't seem to be using it in the technical sense because he has a plural, so they're the secrets of. Simply seems to mean the things that are not hidden of that. Now let's look at the Isaiah issue, and this involves a little bit of Greek, but I'm not expecting you to read or learn it. I've transliterated here and color-coded it to try to make it as simple as possible. So here's the new RSV, and the black is the narrator speaking, the red is the part about hearing, and the purple is the part about seeing. And so in the Septuagint, this is the parallel. Akue, akusete is about hearing, and blepantes, blepsete is about seeing. So that's the order it is in Isaiah. And Luke turns it around, makes the seeing first and the hearing after, but says nothing about Isaiah here. So he says it just very, very simply here. And Mark similarly follows like Luke does, and perhaps Luke is following Mark here in that sense of reversing them, having inherited that. Matthew, though, turns it around here and follows Isaiah exactly. And notice the exact quote here in Matthew. So Matthew, for whom fulfillment of Scripture is really important, and probably the only one of these who could actually follow the Hebrew of it, perhaps Mark could, but we don't know, is using the Septuagint here, because of course that's what they're all writing in is Koine Greek. So Matthew follows it the closest. Luke paraphrases it. Curiously, I'm not going to get into this in detail, but John's Gospel also uses it, but the second verse, 6:10, which the synoptics don't do. And I didn't bother to put the Greek here because our focus here is not on John, but I noticed that John takes several of these pieces of the Isaiah 6:10 element and changes it around. But what's important here, as we go back to this, is to see what the effect of this is on who each of the gospel writers is saying is being prevented from seeing and hearing what they could otherwise see and hear. In Mark, it's a phenomenon throughout Mark that the disciples have no clue. They cannot see, they cannot hear, they cannot understand. This is in chapter 4 when he says directly to them, having talked about others, those outside, but then he turns to them and says, do you not understand this parable? How will you understand all the parables? And then he explains it to them. And later, after the second of the meal feedings, he rails on them the same kind of way. Do you have eyes that not see and ears that not hear, and do you not understand? And all the way through Mark, the disciples are shown as not having a clue. And Mark, of course, the only gospel writer who doesn't include a live resurrection story in the sense of a risen Jesus who appears to the disciples, ends with them having no clue. It's only the one thread from the women's witness that would allow Mark's gospel to have any sense of continuity after Jesus' crucifixion. Matthew, on the other hand, as I was noting, makes a distinction between the Gentiles, or even amongst the Jews, although I'm not sure he'd use that word, who don't see the way Jesus sees things. And so for Matthew, this is not about Jews versus Christians. This is no different than Isaiah himself being told to speak to a people whom God is telling you to speak to, your own people, but God is preventing them from hearing, for reasons having to do with Isaiah that we won't get into here. But having to do with they've already made their choices, so I'm going to let them, I'm going to let them go with the choices they've made here. But Matthew is suggesting that if people stick around with Jesus, they will get it, as we see down here in his longer quote, "But blessed are your eyes, for they do see, and your ears, for they hear. Many prophets and righteous long to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear but did not hear it." So Matthew's disciples, if they're in the house or if they're around Jesus, can have their eyes opened and their ears opened and can see and hear and understand. Luke doesn't go into that kind of detail and never mentions it's from Isaiah. So perhaps some listeners understood that there's a quote there and some not. But when we look closely at the simple thing he says, we hear something else going on. "To others I speak in parables, so that looking they may not perceive, and listening they may not understand." Notice nothing about hardening their heart here. But perhaps it has more to do with a writer like Amanda Miller in her book about hidden transcripts here, using the work of James Scott to highlight what many writers have said about Luke in particular, who's trying to write within the realm where the Romans and their supporters may hear, but knowing that what he's saying is subversive. And if some modern scholars have seen it as not subversive, have not seen this hidden transcript element, which, to paraphrase very briefly Scott's idea, is that oppressed people, knowing that if they speak openly can get in trouble with the authorities, their neighbors, often speak in coded language that they understand, but that others wouldn't understand. Like little children do when the parents are around. They talk in their own code, or hip-hop language, so that people can speak to each other in ways that they understand, even if others are listening, but they don't know the secret code within the in-group. And so it's very possible here that what Luke is doing is writing in a way that the parables make sense to the people that commit to following Jesus and don't make sense to others. Because the actual text of Luke's gospel is not something that many Romans would have had a copy of. Physical texts were rare and expensive and unusual, and not many people could read. So it's not like you just go to your local Barnes & Noble and pick up a copy of the Gospel of Luke. And the people who might have had them in local communities, I'm sure, kept them very quiet and as secret as they could and circulated them among believers, precisely so that outsiders wouldn't get them and perhaps misinterpret them or use them as evidence against them. And some of the irony of this kind of interpretation is many current biblical scholars, embedded as they are in institutions of elite wealth and learning and with their often greatly privileged tenured status, often see Luke's gospel the exact opposite, as trying to conform with the Roman Empire, and perhaps because so many scholars are trying to do their New Testament work, trying to conform to the elite status of the institutions that make them very privileged and comfortable in very similar ways to Luke's audience was in the first place. So the irony is within biblical scholarship, there's probably the same kind of divide as there is in the text between people who read the Gospel of Luke committed to following the anti-imperial way of Jesus that overturns the hierarchy and patronage system of the Roman Empire versus those who want to squeeze Jesus into not only the Roman Empire, but into whatever empire they're a part of in our world today. And so we each have to decide, like the original audience did and like the disciples in the story, if we're on the inside following Jesus or on the outside looking but not perceiving and listening and not understanding. So next time we'll get to the interpretation. And again, Luke, as you can see briefly from the blue here, has added a lot to it that has a lot to do with, again, with the particular issues of what distractions are from following Jesus. And that's where we'll go next time. See you then. Bye-bye.